So today's consideration is going to be of Albert Camus' work called The Myth of Sisyphus. So perhaps we should begin by a consideration of who Sisyphus is. And what is the myth? Who can tell me? This is Greek mythology. Okay? Does anybody know the story of Sisyphus? Sisyphus was condemned by the gods, essentially for being prideful, or what the Greeks called hubristic. Hubris is stepping beyond one's proper station, okay? And so Sisyphus was condemned to spend all of eternity rolling a boulder up a hill, only for the boulder to roll back down, at which point Sisyphus has to walk back down the hill and exert every ounce of strength he has, rolling it back up to the top, only for it to roll back down to the bottom again. And he must do this forever. A completely pointless task. Meaningless suffering. Okay? Now, Camus is using Sisyphus and his plight as a metaphor for the human condition. The idea being that human existence is as absurd, as silly, pointless, meaningless, as rolling a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down. Okay? And it's important to realize the radical absurdity of the life of Sisyphus. Because it is not the case that there is some incentive for rolling the boulder up the hill. It is not that he gets it to the top and then can use it for something like shelter, okay? Or roll it back down into an animal to kill it for food. This is just an absolutely absurd, repugnant fate. And Camus is suggesting from the very beginning, assuming that life itself is just as absurd. That all of our striving, our endeavors, all of our concerns amount to nothing. Just like rolling a boulder up a hill for no purpose at all, for all of eternity. And so the question becomes, if we take the absurdity of life as an assumption, does that absurdity dictate suicide? And so what Camus is doing is setting up a logic of suicide, or asking whether there is a logic to suicide. Does absurdity dictate death? Okay? Just as I might set up a logical argument, okay? If I say that all A are B and all B are C, what necessarily follows? All A are C. And if you accept the truth of these two premises, then you are compelled to accept this conclusion. And that, of course, is the power of deductive logic, valid deductive argument. And of course, that is what we saw Socrates so skilled in the practice of. Socrates will ask you questions and evoke responses, which then, to our surprise, compel us to affirm something entailed by those premises which we didn't realize. And if we are unwilling to accept the conclusion which follows necessarily from those premises, then we must give one or more of the premises up. Okay? So, but instead of asking something purely formal, like this, Camus' question is whether, if we take the fact, or as a fact, that life is absurd, or absurdity itself, as an assumption, if we are convinced of the fact that all of our endeavors and concerns and accomplishments ultimately amount to absolutely nothing, that life is a tale told by a fool, full of pomp and fury, signifying nothing. If we take absurdity as an assumption, must we conclude suicide as the only logical response? And so, the very first line of Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus is one of these famous introductions, like A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? Camus' first sentence is a question. Actually, it's a statement, but it implies a question. And it is, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Whether or not the mind has 9 or 12 categories, and there he's making reference to Kant, whether space is comprised of 3 or 4 dimensions, whether there is a smallest particle, or the universe has a beginning, all of these traditional metaphysical questions are games and come afterward, because first we must answer the question of suicide, whether life is worth living at all. Okay? So one thing we must do is get a handle on what Camus means by absurdity, or the absurd. Okay? Now, the absurd does not just mean that life is meaningless in itself. such as the existentialists maintained, and thus created the obligation to create a meaning for ourselves, but rather the absurd is a conflict of opposing forces. And he expresses this conflict in different ways. The first thing he says about it is that the absurd is the confrontation between human need and world silence. What is it, given the context of existentialism that we've been dealing with, that human beings need most of all? What is it that we desire, strive after most of all?
Good life.
Happiness.
Or some such justification for living. What we desire is a justification for living, despite the fact that to live is to suffer. We crave meaning. We want to live a life of meaning. We want our suffering to matter. We want to make a mark on the world. We want our lives to be significant. Okay? And this is something common to all of us. We all desire meaning, or a meaning, in terms of which to make sense of the things that happen to us in life. Okay? And we saw that according to existentialist doctrine, the responsibility for finding such meaning, which means at the same time creating a meaning for ourselves through action, lies with each individual. We alone must shoulder the burden of establishing meaning. So that is what Camus means by the human need. We need to know. We have a pure desire to know, as Aristotle puts it. We wonder, as Plato puts it. We want to understand the world and our place within it. But that need is met with what Camus calls world silence. What does that mean? Metaphorically speaking, my attempt to create a life of meaning is a question. And so it is as if I am asking the world to provide me with some justification for my own existence, a purpose. But the world gives no answer. It is silent. And so in a sense, we are strangers in this world. We live in the world, but we are not part of this world in a very disturbing sense. Only human beings have this need. My dog does not sit around pondering the meaning of his existence. He just does it. Okay? So the question again is, does the fact that life is absurd, meaning we have an unquenchable thirst to find meaning, but that thirst cannot be quenched by the world, okay? And so what do the existentialists suggest? Creating a meaning. One is not provided for me. As I like to put it, human beings are not born with owner's manuals for living. And even if I subscribe to some interpretation of human existence which can get me through, it is the result of a decision. I decide whose door upon which to knock for counsel. And I will continue to go door to door until I find some answer that can sustain me through the ravages of human existence. But Camus, while basically agreeing with the existentialist starting point, that even if there is a super meaning for human existence, I am not in a position to know what it is, okay? He agrees with that. But where he finds the existentialists deficient is in the way they confront that need for meaning. According to Camus, when I make the leap of faith, to use Kierkegaard's terminology, whether that means an actual leap of religious faith, or whether it means becoming passionate about my life's work, or about family, or whatever it is that fulfills you. And I make that endeavor an ultimate object of satisfaction, such as to say, if I become happy, then my life was worth living. Or if I have a good will, my life was worth living. Or if I care for people, or promote the fundamental goods indicated by the natural inclinations of human beings, such as we have seen in our survey of the major Western traditions in ethics. As soon as I accept some interpretation of human existence that makes it all right, that provides justification for my suffering, according to Camus, I have annihilated the only possibility of living a life of value. For Camus, it is impossible to overcome, or I should say, to negate nihilism. And remember, what is nihilism? Nihilism is the view that life means nihil, nothing. Nothing I do ultimately has any lasting significance, if it ever had any at all. And because nothing has inherent value, then nothing I do is any more important than anything else that I do. Getting married, getting a degree, having a child, completing a project is no more meaningful than breaking a shoelace. Because if nothing matters, then no one experience can be judged qualitatively superior to another experience. Which is why by the end of the first half of the Myth of Sisyphus, which is all I've asked you to read, because the second half really is an excursion into history. Camus says that living a life of value, i.e., becoming greater than my fate, moving beyond nihilism, which of course requires that I do not negate nihilism. I can't move beyond something if it doesn't exist. Requires that I do not reconcile myself to my own life. I must keep the absurd alive. Why? Such that I may revolt against it. Camus' answer to the question, does absurdity entail death through suicide, is no. The absurd does not dictate death, because it is possible, while not for life to have meaning, but rather for it to have value despite its meaninglessness, requires seeing life for what it really is, utterly absurd. And yet, revolting against that absurdity by being defiant. And how do I do that? The only way to revolt against the absurd is to keep the absurd alive. Okay? Which means keeping both poles of the equation alive. So if the absurd is the conflict between human need and world silence, or as he later puts it, my need to reduce the world to a rational principle and the impossibility of doing so. to keep the absurd alive means I cannot cancel out either one of its terms. Okay? This is the logic of the absurd. Now, if I pretend like I don't care, I have no will to meaning, I have no will to power, in Nietzsche's terms, that it doesn't bother me that my life and life in general is meaningless. I'm just going to live for pleasure or something. Then I have canceled out human need. I'm pretending like I don't need to find meaning in life. Okay? But on the other hand, if I admit that I do need to find a justification for my continued existence, and I establish that justification by making a leap of faith of one form or another, right? By subscribing to some interpretation of human existence that makes it justifiable. Then I have canceled out the world's silence. But the absurd can only live where both terms of the equation rage on. And this sounds very much like what Kierkegaard, or how Kierkegaard characterized the meaninglessness of life. Remember, Kierkegaard said that we have an infinite concern for our own lives, the infinite need of inwardness, but that need is met with objective uncertainty. Subjectively speaking, I scramble after a meaning. But if I attempt to approach the question of the meaning of human existence from an objective point of view, the most I can ever hope for is an approximation of the truth, and an approximation of the truth can never satisfy an infinite desire. So for Kierkegaard, that life is meaningless means or signifies the tension between the infinite concern of inwardness and objective uncertainty. Okay? And only if both of those poles remain alive is it possible for reason to despair of its dialectic, making the leap of faith possible. Well, Camus is setting up the absurd much in the same way, as arising from a conflict between my need for meaning and the absence of an answer.
So if you keep the absurd alive,
yes,
you choose to do that, aren't you, in essence, faking it? Like, since you're already aware?
Well, Camus would say that if I subscribe to some interpretation of human existence which makes it all right, and remember, each tradition in the history of ethics is such an attempt. either the good life means virtue or happiness or self-interest or caring or duty, right? And in each case, the moralist sets up some standard which, if I achieve, justifies my existence. Okay? But what Camus does from the beginning is not to argue that life is absurd. He takes it as an assumption, one that he says, if we are truly honest with ourselves, we know to be the case. Even though we do go on living, we choose a path, a career, we find our niche, there is always this nagging, subtle suspicion that none of it means anything. Okay? So Camus does not give us an argument that life is absurd. Rather, as we'll see when we begin to look at the text itself, he describes ways in which the absurd becomes manifest, the way absurdity shows itself. For example, and we'll talk about what these mean next time, what he calls the denseness of the world, or the stranger in the mirror, okay, or man's own inhumanity. These are ways in which the absurdity of life manifest themselves. And if we take the absurd as a premise, the question is the only reasonable answer that we kill ourselves?
And he's not talking about this just from an ethical point. Is he talking about from a psychological point as well? I feel like there's a bit of psychology.
You know, we always want to remember that philosophy and psychology are sister sciences, okay? I mean, especially in the postmodern age, because what is psychology? Study of the psyche, of the mind. And what is philosophy?
The love of wisdom.
If originally, right, the original sense of philosophy, if you ask Plato, is the love of wisdom, and wisdom is the love of truth. But in the postmodern world, philosophy is the mind's confrontation with its own reality. Okay? So yes, we are asking, I suppose, not just logically whether absurdity entails suicide, but also psychologically. Okay? Now here's the thing. According to Camus, if I do take the existentialist way out, which is to create a meaning for myself, okay, then I've blown it, because I have canceled out the silence of the world. I have negated the absurd. I have denied nihilism. And therewith lost the only avenue available for living a life of value. To live a life of value for Camus does not mean the same thing as living a meaningful life, because there is no such thing as a meaningful life, according to Camus. His question is it possible to survive in the desert of meaninglessness without copping out? Okay? Can I look life straight in the face and say, even though I may have accomplished this or that, I know in my heart of hearts that all of this amounts to nothing, and yet still find the strength to live on for no reason whatsoever other than to assert my defiance. Then I can rise above nihilism and reject suicide. You see, Camus regards the existential answer to the meaninglessness of life as a form of philosophical suicide. We essentially kill ourselves when we make a leap of faith because we disburden ourselves of carrying the weight of life's absurdity by ourselves. We must carry it alone. But if I say, hey, life is hard, but if I can only find some happiness in it, or leave the world a better place than I found it, or some other such platitude that makes me feel better about myself, then I have destroyed the only avenue to a life of genuine value. For Camus, to keep the absurd alive means remaining conscious of it, okay? It is purely a shift in consciousness. I must revolt against the absurd, but I cannot revolt against that which does not exist. So I must keep the absurd alive, which means admitting that I desperately need life to matter, and at the same time know that it doesn't. That is keeping the absurd alive. That is the absurd life. The question is, can I live with that? And his answer is yes. By revolting against the absurd. And how do I revolt against it? Simply by living. By substituting the quantity of my experiences for the quality of my experiences. If nothing matters, then I cannot say that although most of my life has been hardship, the few moments of quality, of joy that I have experienced have made it all okay. Because nothing matters. No one experience is any more meaningful than any other experience. They're all equally meaningless. And so, to live a life of value is to pack as much into your life as possible. It is essentially to look life in the face and to say, I know you are meaningless, but I'm going to live anyway because I have that greatness of spirit. And in the end, all that matters is the pure flame of life.
It's so depressingly inspiring.
Yes, it's depressingly inspiring. It's oxymoronic.
Why would you rather die than live anyway? Despite knowing all of this, still.
Right. Exactly. If we take the absurd as an assumption, I can still find some happiness, I can still have pleasure. What I cannot do is talk myself into believing that that pleasure or happiness makes life worth living, because it doesn't.
The thing that makes life worth living is actually living.
Be very careful, because for Camus, life is not worth living. Okay? Life is not worth living, which is precisely why, if I can find the fortitude, the spirit to live anyway, then I am being defiant. Okay? So what we'll see when we turn to the text itself is, first, Camus attempts to evoke a sense of the absurd in us. He wants us to feel it, because it is more of a feeling than it is a rational equation. Okay? Once we feel the absurdity of life, then the question becomes, can I rise above that absurdity? Not cancel it out, but be greater than it. And his answer is yes. There are three ultimate consequences of the absurd life: my freedom, the freedom to choose life for no reason other than to be defiant, my passion, but not passion for any particular way of living, but simply for living at all, and my revolt, my ability to exert every bit of strength and energy, emotional and physical, all for the sake of nothing.
That's the battle I always want to have. I always want something to mean something.
And Camus is arguing it doesn't have to mean anything. Okay? So you've got the basic picture. The question is, does absurdity dictate death? If we take absurdity as an assumption, if we are assured of the fact that life ultimately amounts to nothing, does that acceptance necessitate suicide as the only reasonable response? And his answer is no. By a transformation of my consciousness, I turn what was in the beginning an invitation to death into a rule for life, namely, simply living because I can, not because it's worth it. And I must remain unreconciled to my life. Life must be snatched from my cold grip. I have to hold on to it with every ounce of strength for no reason whatsoever. But if I go through my entire life in the absurd mode, knowing that nothing matters, and yet making the decision to pack as much into this abyss of meaninglessness as I can. But at the very last moment, I call for a priest to make a confession. Then I've blown it. I must remain unreconciled unto death. Camus is not particularly interested in what he calls philosophical suicide. He simply states that it is obvious that somebody like Kierkegaard wants to be cured of life's absurdity. He wants the antidote. Life is meaningless, so darn it, let's create a meaning. Let's find something to be passionate about. So here you see that Camus is much more like Nietzsche, because Nietzsche also thinks that as soon as I create something and rest on my laurels, become complacent because I think that I've arrived, hey, I've done it, I've completed my task, my life's work, and now life is justified, then I've blown it, because the point is not to create X, Y, or Z, but rather the ongoing creation of myself as the will to power, the constant act of self-surpassing. Okay? Now, for Nietzsche, I would say nihilism is a problem. And Nietzsche thinks that I can overcome this problem by aligning myself with my true nature as will to power. Okay?
So is happiness meaningless too?
Absolutely. That doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable, but it doesn't amount to a pile of sand. Okay? Just like Nietzsche's Zarathustra said, the greatest moment I can have is when I feel contempt, disgust for my own happiness, my own virtue, my own reason. Because all along I have been telling myself that happiness ought to justify human existence. The problem is it doesn't. Happiness isn't enough. Reason isn't enough. Virtue isn't enough. In fact, nothing can be enough, because life itself is utterly pointless. And so, the way you put it, what did you say, that it is depressingly inspiring? It is at first shocking, but it is immensely freeing. Because what Camus says is that, look, if you're a traditional moralist or even an existentialist, what you have done is to set up some kind of value equation. You are saying that the good life means X, Y, or Z. But let's say I'm a utilitarian, and I say that goodness means maximizing happiness for all of sentient creation, or at least the sentient beings likely to be affected by my action. Then I have set up parameters within which I must live my life. Because if I step outside of those parameters, then I am no longer justified. And that enslaves me. So Camus is closer to Nietzsche here. Nietzsche is saying, yes, create, but create and then destroy it and create something new. Because what we're really creating is our own will to power. Okay? All right. So on Monday, we will begin to take the half of this book I've asked you to read piece by piece, break it down, and do some literary analysis. Okay? All right.